June 1944, over northern France. A silver-grey fighter knifes through the dawn, sunlight flashing across its broad wings. Below, the fields of Normandy lie broken with smoke and shadow. The engine note deepens, a violent metallic roar, as the pilot shoves the throttle forward. The big radial snarls, and the plane surges ahead like a charging animal. On the German radio bands, ground controllers bark frantic warnings. "Thunderbolts, low level!" Moments later, the P-47 dives, a blur of motion, its 850 caliber guns spitting white fire. An FW-190 tries to roll away, but the American machine doesn't fall behind. It closes the gap, impossibly fast, its new paddle blade propeller biting the air with savage efficiency. The German pilot, once certain he could climb out of reach, now finds himself caught in the gun sight of a monster he no longer recognizes. In a heartbeat, the sky erupts. The fighter once mocked as too heavy, too slow, and too clumsy now rules the air it was never meant to command. The war in the skies has changed, and so has the Thunderbolt. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first entered combat in early 1943, few believed it would ever become a legend. It was massive, over 7 tons fully loaded, with a hulking frame and a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that looked more at home on a bomber than a fighter. To many pilots, it felt more like flying a locomotive than a warplane. German pilots nicknamed it the milk bottle, wide-bodied, slow-climbing, and easy to spot. In those first months over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe held a cruel kind of confidence. Their Bf-109Gs and FW-190As could outclimb, outroll, and outturn the early Thunderbolts with ease. The American pilots, new to long-range escort operations, were often picked apart before their bombers reached the target. The P-47's only redeeming quality at the time was its dive. Once it pointed its nose down, nothing could catch it, not even a Messerschmitt. But climbing back up to altitude was another story. The Germans laughed. A few Luftwaffe reports described the Thunderbolt as a clumsy brute that cannot fight above 20,000 feet. Others dismissed it entirely, believing the Americans had produced another over-engineered failure. But at the Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, New York, engineers refused to accept those verdicts. They knew the engine had more to give, and that its apparent weaknesses weren't in its power, but in how that power met the air. Something was choking the Thunderbolt's potential. The early P-47 used a narrow-chord, toothpick-style propeller inherited from designs meant for lighter fighters. At lower altitudes, it was serviceable. But above 20,000 feet, where the thin air demanded maximum thrust, those blades simply couldn't bite. The massive R2800 engine spun ferociously, but much of its energy was wasted in air, slippage. The result was obvious in combat: sluggish climbs, weak acceleration, and frustrated pilots. Every improvement in engine power brought diminishing returns because the propeller couldn't convert that horsepower into thrust. Engineers at Curtiss Electric and Hamilton Standard, America's 2 leading propeller manufacturers, began running tests. The results were clear. The Thunderbolt needed a blade with more surface area, able to grab more air per rotation, even if it meant adding drag. The answer came in an experimental concept first developed for heavy transports and bombers: the paddle blade propeller, thick, broad, and almost brutal in shape. To the eye, it looked inelegant. To the engineers, it was revolutionary. They tested the new propellers on modified P-47s at Wright Field, Ohio, in early 1944. The data stunned them. Climb rates jumped by 25%. Top speed increased by more than 30 miles per hour. Acceleration was dramatically smoother. The brute had found its missing weapon. And in the skies over France, the Germans were about to meet a Thunderbolt they would no longer recognize. By the spring of 1944, the transformation of the Thunderbolt was no longer theory. It was in motion. At the Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, assembly lines roared day and night. Thousands of workers, welders, riveters, women technicians with kerchiefs and goggles labored under the deafening hum of production. Each new model leaving the line carried a subtle but powerful change, a massive four-blade paddle propeller bolted to the snout of its R2800 engine. These were the P-47D-22REs, and soon after the P-47D-25s, variants that would redefine air combat. The first batches reached England in late April 1944, just weeks before Operation Overlord. Mechanics at bases like Boxted and Halesworth rolled the new Thunderbolts onto the tarmac and immediately noticed the difference. The new prop blades were wide and thick, resembling the paddle of a riverboat more than the narrow, scythe-like shapes they had used before. Pilots who climbed into the cockpit expecting the same old sluggish climb were astonished. The plane leapt off the runway, climbing faster, biting into the air instead of laboring through it. At altitude, the boost was unmistakable, 470 miles per hour at top speed, easily catching or outrunning the Luftwaffe's best piston fighters. The Thunderbolt had been reborn. For the German pilots who had once mocked it, the shock came quickly. In early May, patrols of FW-190As encountered the new Thunderbolts near the French coast. Expecting the usual lumbering duel, they climbed, and the Americans followed. The difference was immediate. Where the earlier jugs would fall behind, these climbed almost effortlessly. German radio chatter grew frantic. "Achtung! Thunderbolts climbing with us? Impossible?" The Allies now had a fighter that could both escort bombers to Berlin and dive to strike ground targets with the force of a thunderclap. Its combination of speed, altitude, and endurance made it one of the most versatile aircraft of the war. And behind the numbers was a deeper truth. This was engineering adaptation under fire. While the Luftwaffe struggled to refine the Mi-262 jet or squeeze more power from the 109's overstrained engine, the Americans had quietly solved their biggest weakness. The Thunderbolt's rebirth wasn't just a triumph of design, it was a triumph of philosophy. In a war where perfection was rare and time was deadly, the Americans had learned to evolve, mid-fight. And that evolution was about to collide with the Luftwaffe head-on over the hedgerows and rivers of Normandy. The secret to the Thunderbolt's transformation wasn't in brute power. It was in how that power met the air. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, already one of the most powerful piston engines of the war, could produce well over 2,000 horsepower. But for months, most of that energy was being wasted. The Thunderbolt's earlier toothpick propellers simply couldn't harness all that torque. They spun fast, but they sliced through the air instead of grabbing it. The paddle blade propeller changed that equation entirely. Its wide, rounded blades created far greater surface area, which allowed the engine to convert its horsepower directly into thrust. The result wasn't subtle, it was violent. Pilots reported that when they opened the throttle, the aircraft no longer eased forward. It lunged. Acceleration was instant. Climb rates that had once been measured in sluggish hundreds of feet per minute now surged to thousands. And unlike many European designs, the Thunderbolt could do this without breaking down. Its air-cooled radial engine, often ridiculed by German engineers who preferred liquid-cooled in lines, proved nearly indestructible. Even when riddled with bullets or losing a cylinder, it could limp home. The propeller and engine together turned the P-47 into an engineering paradox, the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war, yet capable of 470 miles per hour and climbs that stunned its pilots. But speed was only half the story. The new propeller's ability to sustain airflow efficiency at high altitudes made the Thunderbolt deadly at 25,000 feet and above, exactly where the bombers flew and where the Luftwaffe had once ruled. Every spin of that four-blade prop wasn't just motion, it was vengeance. The tactical value of the Thunderbolt had always been misunderstood. In 1943, it was seen as a bomber escort that could defend itself. Nothing more. By 1944, it became the tip of the spear. With the paddle blade upgrade, the P-47 could now climb with the best and dive like a meteor. Pilots used its new speed to redefine dogfighting tactics. Rather than tight turning engagements, they fought in vertical loops, exploiting the Jug's power to climb, roll over, and dive, again before the enemy could react. A Luftwaffe pilot caught in that pattern faced an impossible choice: climb and stall, or dive and be hunted. Either way, the Thunderbolt dictated the tempo. For bomber escort missions, the new speed meant the P-47 could now stay with the formations all the way to deep targets, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin, where previous models had to turn back. The Luftwaffe's ambush zones were erased. And when the air war shifted to ground attack during and after D-Day, the Thunderbolt's performance gave it yet another role: low-altitude hunter. With 8 50-caliber machine guns, it could obliterate convoys, trains, and tanks in a single pass. By the summer of 1944, Thunderbolts were flying up to 1,000 sorties a day over France, shredding German infrastructure while dueling enemy fighters at will. The same plane that once struggled to keep up was now rewriting what air superiority meant. And the Luftwaffe, still confident that their 109s ruled the sky, was about to learn that innovation, not arrogance, decides a war. No engineering chart could capture what it felt like for a pilot to push the throttle of a paddle-prop Thunderbolt for the first time. Men like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and Hub Zemke had flown the earlier models, had wrestled their bulk through the sky, and had seen comrades outclimbed by nimble FW-190s. They knew the humiliation of watching the enemy roll away in smug safety. Then came the new propeller. Robert Johnson later recalled that the upgrade turned the Jug into a beast. When he first tested the new model, he said it felt like a kick in the spine. She just leapt forward. Johnson, one of the first American aces over Europe, claimed the Thunderbolt's rebirth turned him from a survivor into a hunter. Even rookie pilots noticed it. Men who had once dreaded dogfights now chased them. The plane's strength became their armor. They could take hits that would have torn apart a Mustang or Spitfire. Some limped home with holes in their wings big enough to crawl through, the engine still turning. That endurance bred a particular kind of courage. They called the plane the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the name fit perfectly. When the paddle blade prop arrived, the transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Pilots began to trust their aircraft completely. It could fight, dive, climb, and live through punishment. The Thunderbolt became an extension of will, and that confidence mattered as much as horsepower. The Luftwaffe still had aces, but the Americans now had machines that could survive mistakes and turn the tide of battle through sheer staying power. For the Luftwaffe, the change was both sudden and baffling. Through most of 1943, their intelligence assessments of American aircraft were dismissive. Reports from frontline squadrons described Thunderbolts as slow to climb and harmless in pursuit. Luftwaffe veterans mocked them over radio frequencies, calling them flying tanks. But by mid-1944, something changed in the kill reports. German pilots began describing Thunderbolts that could catch them in climbs, Thunderbolts that were outrunning their 190s, Thunderbolts that were faster than before. It didn't make sense. No one had told them that American engineers had redesigned the propeller geometry or upgraded the superchargers. To the Luftwaffe, the sky itself seemed to shift overnight. Their tactical manuals had to be rewritten. New orders cautioned, "Do not assume Thunderbolts can be outclimbed." By autumn, the German High Command realized the gravity of it. Their once superior FW-190A series was now technically inferior to a fighter they had mocked only months earlier. And when the upgraded Thunderbolts began strafing German columns, trains, and airfields after D-Day, leaving smoldering wreckage in their wake, the shock became humiliation. The Luftwaffe had always believed that technology was their advantage, but the Americans had outpaced them not through genius, but through relentless adaptation. The joke was over. The sky now belonged to the flying tank they once laughed at. The invasion of Normandy had changed everything on the ground, but in the air the transformation was even more profound. By June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, the upgraded P-47 Thunderbolts were sweeping the skies above the beaches and inland fields of France. The Luftwaffe had attempted to strike the Allied invasion force, but what little resistance remained in the air was shredded by swarms of American fighters that now seemed faster, higher, and more unrelenting than ever. A formation of FW-19TA-8s attempted a strafing run near Carentan. They were spotted by a flight of Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke. What followed was chaos, the kind of aerial violence that defined the new air war. The German leader banked hard, expecting to climb away as before. The P-47s followed him up, climbing with an ease he had never seen from the big American fighters. Seconds later, tracers ripped through the sky. One German aircraft burst into flame, another spiraled down in black smoke. It was the first time Zemke's men realized that the Thunderbolt was no longer a defensive fighter. It was an executioner. Across the front, reports echoed the same story. P-47 units once assigned to bomber escort began taking on Luftwaffe fighters directly, and winning. The 353rd Fighter Group claimed 20 kills in a single day. Pilots began using the aircraft's enormous dive speed to chase fleeing opponents straight to the deck, then pull out with power to spare. The Luftwaffe called these new jugs Blitzjäger, lightning hunters. And they were right. To Allied mechanics, the proof was mechanical. When captured German aircraft were brought to Allied airfields for testing, engineers found that the new Thunderbolts outperformed the vaunted FW-19TA in almost every metric above 20,000 feet. Even its acceleration at medium altitude rivaled the Bf-109G. It wasn't that the Thunderbolt had become light. It hadn't. It was still massive, still thick-bodied, still ungraceful in the eyes of purists. But it was efficient. Every ounce of that 7 tons now worked in unison. Engine, propeller, supercharger, airframe, each tuned to the limit of wartime engineering. And with the Luftwaffe hemorrhaging veteran pilots and struggling with fuel shortages, the timing couldn't have been worse. In the first month after D-Day, Thunderbolt squadrons claimed over 500 German aircraft destroyed in the air and thousands on the ground. The Luftwaffe's Western Front presence was disintegrating. By July 1944, the Germans weren't laughing anymore. Their airfields were burning. Their fuel depots were shattered. Every road, every bridge, every armored column that tried to move in daylight was under constant attack from Thunderbolts armed with bombs, rockets, and 50 caliber guns. The same aircraft that once crawled through the sky now stalked it like a predator. And for the first time in the war, German pilots began to fear the very sound of its engine, that deep, heavy roar of a radial that meant death was coming from above. By August 1944, the legend of the new Thunderbolt was written not just in air victories, but in the burning wreckage that stretched across France. The Luftwaffe, crippled and reeling, had lost the skies. Now the Thunderbolt turned its attention downward to the German army itself. Patton's Third Army was racing east across the French countryside, advancing faster than any force in modern history. But every roadblock, every armored column, every retreating division that tried to regroup was met by the same terrifying sight: the silver shape of a P-47 screaming out of the sun. From the ground it looked like divine fury, a faint whistle, the growl of a radial engine, then a roar as 8 50 caliber Brownings tore across the line. Trucks burst like matchsticks. Tanks brewed up in seconds as rockets slammed through their hulls. German soldiers began calling it der Schraubenteufel, the propeller devil. And the devil was everywhere. By the time the Battle of the Falaise Pocket began in August, Thunderbolts were flying up to 1,200 sorties per day, pounding German forces trapped in the narrowing corridor. Their improved climb and acceleration allowed them to dive, attack, and re-climb before flak could even track them. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but their once-feared fighters were slaughtered before reaching firing range. In 3 weeks, German Army Group B was annihilated. Tens of thousands of troops were killed or captured, and hundreds of vehicles destroyed. Air superiority, that elusive prize, had finally been won not just through numbers, but through evolution. The new paddle-blade Thunderbolt was the perfect symbol of American warfare. Heavy, loud, and relentlessly adaptable. It didn't need to be beautiful. It just needed to work, harder, longer, and smarter than anything the enemy could field. Captured Luftwaffe pilots were stunned when they examined the new propeller up close. The fat, blunt blades looked almost primitive compared to the sharp-edged German designs. But the performance spoke for itself. The Americans had achieved with incremental innovation what Germany could not with radical design. As one Luftwaffe engineer later remarked, they didn't reinvent the airplane, they perfected the engine that drives the war. The Thunderbolt now ruled every layer of the sky. At high altitude, it escorted bombers to Berlin. At medium height, it dueled fighters and patrols. At low level, it pulverized German armor and convoys. By autumn, the once mocked Jug had become the defining sound of Allied air power. In villages from Normandy to Aachen, children learned to distinguish the deep rumble of a Thunderbolt from the higher pitch of a Mustang or a Spitfire. The sound meant the Americans were near, and that liberation was coming. For the Luftwaffe, it meant something else entirely. The age of German air superiority was over, and all it took was a new set of blades. By the end of 1944, the war in the air over Western Europe was no longer a contest, it was a rout. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies with precision and terror was now reduced to chaos. Its veteran aces, the men who had survived since Poland and France, were either dead, captured, or grounded. Its fuel depots were empty. Its young pilots, barely trained and flying outdated machines, faced an American Air Force that had evolved into something unstoppable. And at the center of that dominance was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the 470 MPH monster that no one had predicted. Between the summer of 1944 and the war's end, Thunderbolt units destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 9,000 locomotives. They flew over 500,000 sorties, absorbing losses that would have crippled other air forces, but never slowing down. For the Allies, air superiority was no longer a strategic dream. It was daily reality. German commanders began writing desperate reports. Our columns cannot move in daylight. Entire divisions were forced to march only at night, hiding under camouflage by day, an impossible task in the face of Allied reconnaissance and relentless Thunderbolt patrols. In short, the Luftwaffe's greatest strength, its mastery of the sky, had been inverted. Now it was the Americans who owned the daylight. And the irony was cruel. The Germans, who had once pioneered aerial innovation, had been undone by it. The Thunderbolt's victory wasn't just about design, it was about industry and adaptability. Republic Aviation, Curtiss Electric, and Hamilton Standard worked together with remarkable speed. In less than a year, they turned feedback from combat pilots into new propeller systems, manufacturing them at scale and fitting them into thousands of planes in the field. This was where the US war machine excelled. It didn't need to invent entirely new aircraft to stay ahead. It could refine existing ones faster than the enemy could react. While the Luftwaffe pinned its hopes on the Tu-62 jet, an engineering marvel delayed by production bottlenecks and Hitler's interference, the Americans simply perfected the machines they already had. By the time German engineers finished debating whether to produce more jets or upgrade their piston fighters, Thunderbolts were already burning their fuel dumps and strafing their airfields. It was industrial warfare at its purest form, not about brilliance, but about persistence. And the result was devastating efficiency. The Luftwaffe had built better fighters. The Americans built more and made them better every month. When the war finally turned toward Germany's borders, the Thunderbolt had evolved beyond recognition. What began as a heavy, sluggish escort fighter was now an apex predator of the Allied air fleet, faster, deadlier, and more feared than ever. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was a shadow of itself. Entire squadrons grounded by fuel shortages, production crippled by Allied bombing, veteran pilots replaced by barely trained cadets with just a few hours in the cockpit. Against them came the P-47s, flying high in formation, escorting bombers towards the Rhine and sweeping the skies clean of resistance. In January 1945, the Thunderbolt's reputation was sealed during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last desperate attempt to regain air superiority. Hundreds of German fighters launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields, but even in their moment of aggression, the Luftwaffe was torn apart. Thunderbolt units scrambled within minutes, counterattacking with ferocity. The Germans lost nearly 300 aircraft in a single day. After that, their war in the West was finished. To the soldiers on the ground, the Thunderbolt became a constant companion. Its low growl overhead meant cover, safety, progress. To the Germans, it meant the opposite, exposure and annihilation. In its final months, the Jug became the symbol of American might. Not elegant, not sleek, but unbreakable, dependable, and everywhere. The P-47's massive engine, thick armor, and powerful new propeller made it almost indestructible. Dozens of pilots survived crash landings or limped home with cylinders shot out, oil streaming down the fuselage, holes in every wing, and the engine still running. It was more than a fighter. It was a promise. The Americans were coming, and nothing could stop them. By the time production ended in late 1945, over 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built. They served in every theater of the war, from Europe's skies to the jungles of Burma. And though the jet age was dawning, the P-47 left behind a blueprint that would define modern American engineering: upgrade, adapt, and overwhelm. The Luftwaffe had learned that lesson too late. The monster they had mocked into existence, the plane they once joked could barely climb over a barn, had risen above every battlefield, transforming from laughingstock to legend. When the war ended, German engineers studying captured Thunderbolts didn't scoff anymore. They measured, they photographed, and they wrote one quiet sentence in their report. This aircraft achieved perfection through persistence. They are decided by those who learn faster, those who adapt when others stand still. The P-47 Thunderbolt began as a punchline, a machine too big to turn, too heavy to climb, too crude to win. Even its own pilots doubted it. The Luftwaffe laughed. Engineers debated whether to cancel it entirely. And then someone changed the blade. A single shift, wider propellers, thicker edges, a better grasp of the air, turned wasted horsepower into dominance. It turned a brute into a hunter. And that small, technical leap rippled across the entire war, rewriting the balance of power in the skies. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, it was too late. Their jets were still in factories. Their aces were gone. Their skies were filled with silver wings that no longer struggled to rise. The Thunderbolt story isn't just about metal or machinery. It's about the nature of innovation under pressure. It's a reminder that in the chaos of war, victory often belongs not to the first idea, but to the one that keeps improving. The Germans saw an ungainly fighter. The Americans built a monster that learned to fly faster than anyone could imagine. And when it came roaring through the clouds at 470 miles per hour, the laughter finally stopped.